Hola a todos. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I hope everybody had a great break. If you're just joining us for this panel, welcome. I'm really excited. Let me introduce myself. I'm Cristel Jusino Diaz. I'm Centro's Director of Research Programs and Public Humanities. And I am thrilled to be moderating this panel, Living with and or Under the Shadow of U.S. Empire in the 20th Century. I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers in the order that they will be presenting, and then I'm gonna leave it over to them so that we have plenty of time for discussion. So first, I'll start with Keith L. Camacho, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is also the author of Sacred Men, Law, Torture, and Retribution in Guam from Duke University Press 2019, the editor of Repping Pacific Islander Youth and Native Justice from the University of Washington Press in 2021, and the co-editor of Militarized Currents Toward a Decolonized Future in Asia and the Pacific from the University of Minnesota Press in 2010, and his presentation is titled 1898 and Its Indigenous Diasporas, Samoan Youth Mobility Across American Samoa and Hawaii. Following Keith, we'll have Adrienne de Leon, who is the author of Barangay, an offshore poem. I hope I pronounced that right. Barangay, sorry. An offshore poem from Buck Writer Books 2021, and Bundok, a hinterland history of Filipino America from the University of North Carolina Press, forthcoming December 2023. His current book project, Balikbayan, The Invention of the Filipino Homeland, is under contract with the University of Washington Press. He is the 2024 Jack and Nancy Farley Distinguished Visiting Scholar in History at Simon Fraser University and an incoming assistant professor of U.S. History here at New York University. His presentation title is Jose Rizal as Political Theology, Filipino Nationalism, and the Diasporic Colonial State. Following, we have Ana Maria Dopico, who is the director of the Hemispheric Institute here at NYU and associate professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. From 2014 to 2019, she was director of the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center at NYU, and in 2017 was the principal investigator of the Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Cuban Futures Beyond the Market at NYU. She is a comparative scholar of the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Global South, and works on the cultural and intellectual history of the American Hemisphere. She has published, lectured, and shared public scholarship on the novel, art in Latin American politics, political insurgency in the Americas and the Global South, Latinx and American Identity, Jose Marti, The Cuban Revolution, Cuban National and Diasporic Imaginaries, Photography, Empire, and Political Emotion, and the work and legacies of Edward Said. Her presentation today is titled Explosions, Monuments, Zombies, 1898's Primal Scene and Its Afterlives. After that, we have Monica A. Jimenez, who is a poet and a historian. She is currently assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Latino Studies, Centro Journal, Radical History Review, and XX Salon, among others. Her first book, Making Never Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, will be published in 2024 by the University of North Carolina Press. Her presentation today is titled Experimental Station, the U.S. and the Remaking of Puerto Rico in the 20th Century. And closing this panel out, we have Ileana M. Rodriguez Silva, who is the Lawrence J. Rosemond Endowed Professor in Latin American and Caribbean History at the University of Washington. She is the author of Silencing Race, Disentangling Blackness, Colonialism, and National Identities in Puerto Rico, published by Palgrave in 2012, and co-editor of The Politics of Storytelling in Island Imperial Formations, Special Issue Positions, Asia Critique, Volume 21, Issue 1, 2021, and her presentation is titled The Case for Independence is Reparations for Slavery. And with that, I'm going to leave you with Keith.
Hafide, talofa, and hello. Before I begin, I want to sincerely thank Matthew, Emily, Cristel, and the many folks who made this symposium possible. I also want to acknowledge the Lenape and the surrounding American Indian tribes of New York. I want to express as well my deep appreciation to the Samoan communities of California and Aotearoa, New Zealand, for helping me to develop my larger project on Samoan OGs or original gangsters. Today, I focus on one part of this project by examining the place of Hawaii in the Samoan collective imagination of the mid-20th century. My talk is titled 1898 and its Indigenous Diasporas, Samoan youth mobility across American Samoa and Hawaii. Tolo Lava. On December 24, 1951, the acting governor of American Samoa, John C. Elliott, wrote to Congressional Representative Fred L. Crawford about an upcoming trip to Washington, D.C. In his letter, acting Governor Elliott also included a Samoan song that conveyed the aspirations of hundreds of Samoans to join the U.S. military and to travel the world. Translated into English, the song, Wake Up, Samoan Boys, depicted Samoan youth interpretations of the U.S. Department of Interior, their home archipelago of Samoa, the port city of Honolulu in Oahu, and the vital significance of Atua, or God, in their everyday lives. The song read in part, quote, Samoan boys, wake up. You have attained success. The government of the interior is sponsoring the volunteers. Pray that our loyalty be materialized. We desire to go to Honolulu. Do not forget Samoa, its culture and folklore. Thanks to the interior that has done fearful things, that has made famous the name of Samoa throughout the world, all galore. Samoa, my beloved country, may you, my dear, be successful. You must be brave and place your trust in God, end quote. Composed after World War II, the song represented Samoan boys, their excitement for the end of U.S. naval rule in 1951, and their anticipation of the Department of Interior as the new governing body of American Samoa, an unincorporated territory of the United States in 1956. The song likewise referenced the fearful things of the Department of Interior, an allusion to the military power of the United States during and after the war. But unlike the social movements of former US territories like Hawaii and the Philippines, and current US territories like the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and Puerto Rico, the Samoan High Chiefs of American Samoa did not necessarily employ the assimilationist, decolonial, labor, and or humanitarian rhetoric of these and other movements in the 20th century. Notwithstanding the Samoan Mao movement of the early 1900s, which sought additional resources from the US Navy, the Samoan High Chiefs and the wider Samoan community do not historically treat 1898 and the making of the US empire as entirely problematic. And I can share more about that in the Q&A. Much like how the youth musically praised the Department of Interior with the hopes of boarding a ship from Samoa to Hawaii, the Samoan High Chiefs have also appropriated the economic opportunities, material resources, and political symbolism of the US empire to uphold Samoan cultural traditions and their communal stewardship of the land and seas and Samoa. As Fa'anofo Lisa Claire Uparesa and Adriana Maria Garriga Lopez explained, quote, precisely because of the anomalous protection of Samoan culture and political practice in US law, many Samoans hold a sedimented conception of their relationship with the United States as fundamentally beneficial and sustained by mutual goodwill, end quote. This is not to say, however, that the shadow of the US empire, the theme of our panel, does not resonate in Samoa. On the contrary, the hundreds of Samoan youth who aspired to travel to Honolulu in the 1950s actually reinforced and reified the US colonial boundaries in and between American Samoa and Hawaii, then a US territory and now a state. In fact, numerous young men from different villages had joined the Fita Fita, or the Landsmen and Soldier Unit of the US Navy, as early as 1900. In a letter to the US government concerning the improvement of life in American Samoa, and dated January 5, 1953, the High Chief Tulefele Faiaonga elaborated upon the decades-long relationship between the US military and the ambition of Samoan youth to reside and work in Hawaii. He said, quote, the invasion of Samoan shores by the armed forces, the introduction of new ideas and Western luxuries, and the great influence of the American movie have all contributed toward this new burning ambition for a new change of life in Samoa for the Samoans, end quote. Another Samoan by the name of M.F. Tuiolosenga shared similar sentiments in a letter to the governor of American Samoa in the 50s, sentiments that partly emerged by way of Samoan migration to Hawaii, California, and beyond. With his newfound perspective of living abroad and engaging the wider citizenry of the United States, Tuiolosenga discussed the limitations of U.S. governance in Samoa. He also presented with greater clarity the Samoan perception of increased freedom in Hawaii. Quote, during the half century of the naval government in Samoa, Tuiolosenga stated, the people have not been given the entire freedom of speech. Additionally, he claimed that Samoans did not fully promote their way of living and that their business owners encountered barriers in importing merchandise. As a result, he observed, quote, a number of people left Samoa to seek freedom in the territory of Hawaii and the United States. Once a Samoan set foot on these lands, he continued, he begins to give up hope to return to his native land as he is no longer under the influence of the dictatorial government, end quote. Samoa Ne, a periodical published by the High School Alumni Association and written for the youth in American Samoa, confirmed the prestige and status that accompanied one's residency in Hawaii and the continental United States. The authors of the newsletter even pushed back against the authority of Samoan elders, indirectly critiquing the high chiefs and calling for the fulfillment of man's spirit and his ambitions by way of youth ability. With regard to the migration of youth from Samoa to Hawaii, the editors of Samoa Ne had this to say, quote, to you who are in the colleges and universities in Honolulu and the United States, to you who are in the armed forces, and to those of you who are working as civilians, to you we say, Mahalo tamawhai, or good try. In the eyes of Samoa's young, you are the pioneers, the explorers of a new world of knowledge and understanding, end quote. As the Samoan high chiefs and youth came to terms with the place of Hawaii in their collective imagination, they often used the laonga, or formal speech, to give high praise to Atua or God first and foremost. Second, this diverse group of military personnel, high schoolers, politicians, entrepreneurs, stowaways, and even impersonators, all of them lavish metaphors of goodwill and blessings upon the interior and the US government, and at times criticize them for their failures and shortcomings. But their main goal to travel to Hawaii never faltered. It was a collective convergence of all these competing interests to get to Hawaii. By the 1960s, Samoan youth and their extended families began to migrate between American Samoa, Hawaii, and California at the rate of about 100 a month. What does this mean for living with and under the US empire? Unbeknownst to the youth, high chiefs, and others in American Samoa, the Samoan migration to the 1950s did not create a path to citizenship or foster greater constitutional protections as one might anticipate. Rather, the ties between American Samoa and Hawaii have been greatly militarized, making it difficult but not necessarily impossible to abolish or mitigate the US military's occupation and indirect rule of these and other sites in Oceania, but also greater East Asia and also the Caribbean. In this regard, the chiefly endorsed and youth-inspired effort to explore man's spirit in Hawaii led to the making of a militarized Oceania, premised on Samoan migration patterns and remittance networks on the one hand, and US military operatives and the uneven application of the US Constitution on the other. To demilitarize American Samoa and Hawaii, then, one must seriously reckon with both US, American, and Samoan forms of power, the very systems navigated by the youth in their desire to visit Hawaii in the mid-20th century. Only then can we better engage the equally significant matter of Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli sovereignty, if not altogether foreground indigenous and people of color youth as historical agents of law and politics, migration and diaspora, and much more. Sujus Masi, Favatay Lava, and thank you.
Agyamanak amin ka naimbaga malamyo. That means thank you everybody and good afternoon in Ilocano. I changed the title a little bit to think kind of productively but also freshly about some research I've been doing over the last couple of years, but especially over the last couple of weeks. So this is completely fresh. And most of this research was done at the Newberry Library, which itself has a really deep, insidious colonial history, especially in and around the organization of materials from the Philippines, which are organized under American Indian Studies. All right, and I'm just gonna offer that as a first provocation. So next slide. The project I'm gonna discuss today began with a picture on the right. And this is a picture of, I'm estimating roughly 14, 15-year-old migrant worker before World War II, somewhere in between California, Washington State, and Alaska, right? He was one of the, what came to be called the Manong generation, right? Those pre-World War II Filipino migrants who worked in the canneries and the farms, right? And especially in Central Valley, California. And here he is wearing Masonic regalia. But this is not for a chapter of the Freemason organization writ large. This is a chapter of an organization modeled after the Freemasons that was first founded in the Philippines and then was refounded in San Francisco in roughly 1924 called the Caballeros de Dimas Alang. Dimas Alang being the code name of the gentleman on the left, who is Jose Rizal, who is considered the Filipino martyr, nationalist, right? The sort of iconographic Ubermensch around which Philippine citizenship, racial citizenship, economic and cultural citizenship was forged during the 20th century. And what I got interested in is why does this non-Tagalog working class young man come to mimic, right, and imitate and perform particular modes of aspirational citizenship modeled after Rizalista iconography. And I found hundreds of pictures of members of these organizations really across the Pacific, especially in places like Stockton, California, Seattle, Washington, and Chicago, Illinois. And they all these different geographies mapped onto roughly the class status, right? So the pensionados, right, the migrant students, most often went to places like Chicago. They were involved with the Rizalista organizations out there after the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. But it was mostly migrant workers from non-Tagalog, non-metropolitan, non-elite places in the Philippines that at some point during the 1920s and the 1930s came to really cosmologically synchronize themselves with the Tagalog-centric bourgeois Filipino nationalism, right? And this really informs some of the work I've been doing on this next project, which is informed by these research questions. Number one, how and to what effect does the iconography of Jose Rizal circulate amongst various diasporas, right? So pensionado students, farm workers across the Pacific during the first half of the 20th century. Number two, to scale up, how did the masses of multi-ethnic, polylingual, and working class emigres from the archipelago come to identify with a Philippine nationalism that was really both emergent, right, but also becoming codified by the colonial state itself, right? That is distinctly bourgeois, Manila-centered, and Tagalog. And I want to bring up Manila here because we often think about now Manila being, you know, the epicenter of Philippine post-colonial power. It's where Malacanang Palace, the seat of government, is. But prior to 1898, there were many centers of power across the archipelago. This is, for example, Iloilo, right, in the Visayas, right? This is Vigan, right, the Spanish colonial city in northern Luzon. This is Davao. This is Cotabato. There are all these little pockets, right, of different kind of diffuse powers that really the United States had to reckon with as they were consolidating what I'm coming to call a counterinsurgent nationalism for the colonial formation of the Philippine nation state. And I'll explain that a little later. And to scale up, accounting for the post-colonial regime's claims to both a bounded archipelagic territory and a global surplus population diasporas that the Philippines continues to export until today, what and how exactly does the Philippine nation state work? And one of the things I want to advance today, and I'll explain towards the end, is I want us to think about the Philippines as a diasporic colonial state, one that had to reckon with both the economic impetus to continue to export labor and then human capital through the 20th and 21st centuries, but also thinking about that diaspora as its fundamental political crisis, right? What do you do when you have a bounded, global South nation state that also is trying to lay claim to the very thing it exports, right? Which is people like ourselves, right? For Filipinos in this room. And so, next slide, please. And so I got interested in this group, Jose Rizal, as part of the Ilustrados, right? So he was born in 1861, I believe it was. My Rizalista history is not that great. And he was born in Calamba, right, which is outside of Manila. And he was part of the landed Chinese mestizo, Tagalog mestizo, land-owning class, right? So the hacenderos, right? And as the children of one of these landed families, his parents, like many others around him, sent him to finish school and do graduate school in Europe, right? Which was now much more proximate to the Philippines after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, right? There were large swaths of middle class, upper class Philippine students traveling to Europe to try to study things like, for Rizal, ophthalmology and the liberal arts. Right? He was figuring out how to write. He was figuring out how to really be a flaneur, right? Like a lot of his most fascinating writings are just his travel notes. Like he actually traveled to the United States by way of San Francisco and then went across and went back to Europe, right? It's just really fascinating to think about his global transits and how that really forged, next slide, a lot of the literature that he wrote. And these are the two most well-known, these are really the two finished novels that he had. He tried to write a Tagalog third novel, like that secret third project, but he could never finish it because his Tagalog was atrocious. And so he wrote in Castellano, right? And so I want to preface here as well, and for folks who work on the Spanish colonial Pacific, that unlike Latin America, right, only about 2-3% of the Philippine population spoke Spanish. Right, and these were the elites, and so Spanish became the language of the priests, right, and the elites. And for the native Filipinos, it's why we could still speak our vernacular languages. I started in Ilocano, which is a vibrant language, right? And that was because I'm here citing the work of Vicente Rafael, for example, right? That was the work of the Catholic missionary system, who monopolized political control through the monopolization of linguistic control. So the colonial subject would not have access to the king and therefore could not speak Spanish. But there was this new landed, gentry in the Philippines who were sending their children to go study in Spanish schools and things like that, right? And they're trying to really write in the tradition of Spanish realism and liberalism. But you could see, for folks who haven't read these two books, you could see a sort of like satirical realism that still kind of espoused, his hopes for the incorporation of the Philippines into the Spanish, full Spanish national polity. And you could see that really shift with El Filibusterismo into a full-on sort of Count of Monte Cristo-esque real revenge plot, right? And I would invite folks who couldn't get access to these books to read it. Really fascinating work, especially in its olfactory senses. Rizal was obsessed with smell a lot, right? He would talk about the smell of the Pasig River. He would talk about the smell of La Naturaleza versus the smell of the steamships, right? To think about, sort of colonial critique through the senses. Next slide, please. Rizal was executed for his subversion, for being a filibusterismo, in 1896 on December the 30th. He left behind a large corpus of works, and his death, his execution by the Spanish, really became the powder keg for the launching of the 1896 Philippine Revolution. And it was taken upon by the revolutionary organization, the Katipunan, who then mobilized, right, especially Tagalog, but also across Luzon and the archipelago as well, mobilized everyday people to combat the Spanish. Mind you, one of the things I want to hang on to as I'm exploring this topic is they were not reading Rizal's work. All right, they were understanding Rizal vis-a-vis what Reynaldo Ileta would call, the passion play, right? The sort of sacrificial figure of somebody who sacrificed themselves for the good of the nation, right? There's a sort of messianic quality to the mythology of Rizal. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of text. This is mostly for me. You don't got to read it. What I'm interested in is less about Rizal's life and Rizal's work and more about the exhumation of Rizal, right? That he becomes literally and figuratively and iconographically dug up by the American occupation in order to forge what I am calling a counterinsurgent nationalism, right? A nationalism that is deeply controlled and deeply deliberate in terms of trying to repurpose Rizal not as a figure of anti-colonial revolution, right, but as a figure of anti-Spain, right? And you could see the ways that the Philippine legislators, the Philippine Commission, were really trying to debate, how is it that we turn Rizal into a figure that comes to work for us? Because at the very same time, especially in Manila, there are huge labor movements. There's a huge revolutionary movement across the islands during the early American occupation that also came to take up iconography of Rizal itself. And so when we think about the counterinsurgent quality of the American colonization of the Philippines, there's also this ideological and cultural character that's going on at the same time, right? Which is how does this martyr, right, become repurposed by the American government that now literally forges the political consciousness of nationalist Filipinos who we are taught to model ourselves after Rizal. Let's be learned, let's do education, let's be bourgeois, let's be genteel, right? Let's be like these 19th century elites. And I want to argue that was really constitutive of how we understand the development of the American colonial state in the Philippines, and not just in sort of discursive ways, but in really material ways, right? And this is why I'm calling the conversion of Rizal iconography into political theology becomes this ideological infrastructure through which American power is brokered and consolidated. Number one, around Manila. Number two, around the Tagalog elite nationalism. And number three, along the boundaries of a particular controlled form of the nation state, right, that is brokered by the United States. In effect, there become multiple Rizals exhumed into circulation. During the American occupation, a hegemonic articulation of the national martyr emerges as a political theology for the fledgling colonial state as it systematically consolidated its native allies and manufactured its consent to govern. This state Rizal travels across the Pacific and entangles with other diasporic articulations across geographical context and social class. Next slide, please. What I'm looking at in part of the project I'm working at right now is that what was not necessarily in circulation was Rizal's texts, right? Even till this day, like K-12 education in the Philippines, they read, state translated abridged versions of Noli and Fili. It's like those I don't know, the yellow wallpaper like we read in school, which is like a great text, right? But it's like one of those assigned texts, but it's assigned in translation. So number one, it loses the teeth of the actual text, right? For folks who have read it, and number two, it's abridged, right? So I'm still digging through this. I'm really interested in the omissions that are made in that process of translation. Indeed, it appears that the Philippine Commission did not necessarily promote the reading of nationalist literature, and because Rizal wrote in Spanish, the vast majority of native Filipinos could not read his work in the original language. Therefore, Rizal was repurposed by the state through other terrains, and some of the dimensions I'm looking at. Number one, spatial organization. There was a Rizal province that becomes declared in 1901, right? And built environment, there are Rizal monuments that emerged during the American colonial period that are still standing, around which the government organizes Rizal Day every December the 30th, right? There's this disciplining and enclosure of revolutionary energy, right, that was going on at the same time. This is what I'm arguing that was really going on with the American colonial state. Number two, performance, right, through these Rizalista sort of pseudo-Masonic organizations, right? Ritual. I'll show you some of the codes, some of the ritual handbooks later. Attire and comportment. Images, including and especially photography. And I invite folks interested in the Philippines to go to Seattle. I wanted to come to Seattle for graduate school, as you know. Anyway, I still regret it. It's just an expensive city. Anyway, and look at the hundreds and hundreds of photographs being produced by Filipino migrants themselves. And think about that in terms of an aspirational politic. What is being rehearsed with these photographs, right? Number four, temporal and cosmological orientation, the Rizal Day commemorations, right? The processions, right? June 12th versus the 4th of July. Which one is Philippine Independence Day, right? Which one do we celebrate? I'm really inspired here, of course, by Keith Camacho's work in terms of thinking about the spatial and temporal aspects of historical memory. And then translation and pedagogy, right, as I mentioned. Next slide. I'll just give you just very, very brief examples, right? This is Rizal Province, right, on the left that gets declared through Act number 137 in June 1901, and that's the Philippine Commission up top. And then the next year, the Philippine Commission passes Act number 305, declaring December the 30th as Rizal Day. And mind you, this is all going on during, the Philippine-American War, right? So thinking about those affective landscapes at the same time as we're thinking about these material landscapes of really war and genocide, right? I actually gives us a lot more texture in terms of how we think about this period. Next slide. This is the Rizal Monument, which is still standing, and it had to get repaired over and over again. And it took really 12 years for this, from the first passage of the Philippine Commission to fundraise for this, to the actual building of the monument. And they got an Italian artist, and they translated the advertisement for artists to do submissions, not to any of the native Philippine languages, but to French, to Italian, to Spanish, and to English, right? So who has artistic capacity, right, is also part of this colonial project. Next slide, please. I wanted to think as well about the way that the diaspora becomes really seized into these projects. Like there are, before the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of the associations of Filipino-American migrants are around their hometown, right? They speak their native languages, everybody's from the same hometown, everyone's from the same families. But at the point of Filipinization, right, that transitional point between 1913 and 1934 with the declaration of the Commonwealth, Philippine elites start to go to the diaspora and start to organize these nationalist organizations, which become incredibly powerful, the tens of thousands of members. Next slide. Right, they're doing banquets and they're doing proto-PowerPoint slides about the economic development of the Philippines. Next slide. These are the ritual handbooks, right? Unang baitang ng mga talinghaga ng di masalang, right? So these are for the initiates, right? Next slide. I'm just going to very briefly allude to this. Some of y'all might have heard about the burial of Cecilia Navarro and the murder. It came out of this movie, The Celine Archives, by Celine Parenya-Shimizu at UC Santa Cruz. For folks interested in that, these organizations were also trying to rehearse sovereign power. Like they had penal codes, especially around to control the movement of women across race, right, and not just across space, and really think about Filipino nationalism and try to enforce it violently, right, through executions even, as a reproductive project for the future of the nation, right? And this is where a little bit of that settler colonial critique comes in as well. Next slide. Right, I just want to, that's Millennial Rizal, by the way, I just couldn't help but throw it in, right? The way I want to conclude is that Rizalista nationalism provided the cultural resources for the American occupation to experimentally organize a colony as a nation colonial state or a nation state, right? This is sort of, and I'm inspired here by the work of Yadiman Bonilla, right? If we separate the nation and the state, right? And we denature the form itself, right? And then reconstitute it. One of the things we find with the Philippine case is you have to think first and foremost about the diaspora. I don't believe that Philippine and Filipino-American history are separate. That is a falsehood. That is a complete falsehood. Ethnic and area studies, that separation, that is a colonial construction, right? Especially when you have a Southeast Asian nation under multiple imperial occupations that was diasporic from the onset. I was trying to figure out, to control, to manage, to consolidate the movement of the very people to whom it lays biopolitical claim, let alone geopolitical claim in the archipelago. Right? Thus, the history of the colonial state between 1898 and the 1942 invasion of Japan can be reimagined through the foundational role of transnational migration and the shifting quality of the Philippines' political economic administration and the efforts to consolidate territorial sovereignty and racial citizenship while simultaneously reckoning with a national population that moves outside of its borders. Long story short, this history of the nation state through diaspora is also a history of the formation of an ethno-state. And that's where I want to end. Thank you very much.
In the last few years, in trying to grapple with a book that I find hard to finish about Cuba, explosions and bombs have become important to me to understand not only a kind of foundational violence and colonial violence, but also a political unconscious, a diasporic political unconscious around violence and terror and censorship and silence. So that's part of the background I grew up in Miami's diaspora in the hard exile, where don't start my time yet because they don't have the sun. I'm going to be like Fidel with my finger up and down. Where when I was, 9, 10 years old, 30 bombs went off in 1 year, right? And it's only struck me in the last year that maybe this was something I needed to think about. So I wanted to talk to you about the primal scene of 1898, which is the Maine. The explosion of the Maine, which is the first time I ever heard that word, was at home, probably when I was a child. And it was only later that I understood that the word was Maine, and that it was a ship, and that the ship was a ship that exploded in Havana Harbor. So I called this the primal scene, the explosion of the USS Maine, not to linger on it, but rather to reflect on what it has meant and its undead lives, right? Freud started writing about the primal scene as the moment when a child, and it's important to think that Freud is theorizing the unconscious at the height of empire, right? Of European and US empire. When the child sees his parents having sex, right? And that becomes an inchoate memory that is embodied, that gives rise to symptoms, to fantasies, to inexpressible consequences and after effects. And so that's where the primal scene of the Maine, that's where that coding comes from. The primal scene of empire, right? The explosion of a naval ship at the dawn of naval power and the transoceanic and archipelagic imperial imaginary that's being created in the United States. The primal scene of empire, of the misrepresentation of an accidental explosion, right? Weaponized into war, the explosion into mass print capitalism and Hearst's yellow journalism, right? So there's the kind of American primal scene of this, right? Then there's a Cuban primal scene regarding bombs, regarding dead bodies, regarding internment, regarding terrorism on and offshore of the island. And then there are a series of popular culture consequences of that as well. In 1968, Memorias de su Desarrollo is premiered. It's a film, probably the masterpiece of Cuban cinema by Tomás Gutiérrez Alea. And the protagonist looks over the city with binoculars on the balcony of his kind of rather privileged, beautiful apartment, and looks at the monuments, particularly dwelling on this, which is the monument to the Maine, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, which had been de-eagleized, right, in that moment. And he reflects on sort of the banality of the monuments of the city, how the city looks absolutely still, but he reflects that somehow something has changed. What I love about that film is the way that the mining and the monumentalization of that story is degraded, is made banal, is something that's already sinking into the backdrops of broken monuments, decapitated things that are falling to pieces. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15th, 1898. Next slide. Subsequent to that explosion, a series of, the explosion was used as sort of excuse, right, to whip the country into war, into what was already, there's a wealth of scholarship on this, a cascading campaign in the public press to push the United States into imperial war, in particular in the Caribbean and then in the Pacific. Next slide. These are illustrations from the time, that's from Harper's Bazaar. And the accusation was that the Spaniards had exploded the ship. Next slide. The remains that were recovered immediately were ceremoniously put into these ornate hearses, which are like royal carriages, by the Spanish in the city and given kind of these cortege funerals. Next slide. However, what was less covered in the press is that what was remaining in the water among what was remaining in the water of the wreck were bodies that had not been detected and were picked clean by vultures and other birds of prey and were only found later. Next slide. The actual main turret of the USS Maine went on to become a monument at Arlington National Cemetery. Next slide. The first proper memorial to the USS Maine and its victims, and it's important to dwell on the victims here. 2/3 of the crew died, 260, only 2 officers included, 30 Black seamen, and it included folks that had been recruited as cooks and kind of waiters in China, in Japan, and in the Philippines, actually, right? So these are among the dead. And the first memorial was inaugurated in Key West, right? Those bodies were sent to Key West and interred there, and that memorial was inaugurated in 1900. Next slide. In 1913, if you go up to Central Park, the USS Maine National Monument was inaugurated as one of the keystones, right? The gates to Central Park and that project. Next slide. And then in 1915, Woodrow Wilson inaugurated the USS Maine Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. And it's a weird memorial because it served as a sort of hotel for the dead over the years, right? Where people like Paderewski, a famous musician, when people were being transported, they sort of held their bodies there. So the weight of bodies and the thought of bodies is not something that's thought of in terms of the Maine because it's abstracted right into ideology. So I want to dwell with bodies and decay. Next slide. In Cuba itself, the monument, which was living under the Platt Amendment, right, and everything that involved, right before the Platt Amendment was lifted, the first monument was erected. It was inaugurated in 1925, and that's a blurry image with an eagle whose wings are stretched upward. That monument that you see there was destroyed by a hurricane in 1926, which I really love in a way, because hurricanes speak. Next slide. This is the subsequent monument with different columns. Lions were added, busts of a president and the governor were added, and the eagle's wings are spread horizontally. There's also bodies of eagles here, right? The original eagle was taken down and was in the garden of the US Embassy in Havana. Next slide. By 1961, with the revolution's triumph, to the victims of the Maine who were sacrificed by the imperial veracity and their desire to gain control of the island of Cuba, right? This was added to the document. This is the monument that's seen in Memorias de Subdesarrollo, right? By then, and by 1961, a new primal scene of explosions on the shores of Cuba had taken place. Next slide. In 1960, the French munitions ship, it was a French freighter and cargo ship, La Coubre, exploded in Havana Harbor. It killed dock workers. It killed about 60 people altogether, 27 dock workers in particular. Next slide. The explosion itself in 1960 prompted a show of, revolutionary solidarity and force, and became another primal scene for the revolution. Next slide. There you see Fidel, Dorticos, Che, William Morgan, who was subsequently executed because he was blamed in part for the explosion. In the wake of that, you know the images of Corda, the beautiful image of Che Guevara, right? So at the gathering to memorialize the explosion of La Coubre, can we go back one slide? The Corda took those famous pictures. The other thing that's notable about that memorialization is where Fidel first used the phrase "patria muerte venceremos," right? So it's like fatherland or death, right? Something that's in the last few years become exceedingly problematized, right? Next slide. In 2011, there was a commemoration on the Muelles de la Coubre, right? Celebrating, and that's kind of a sort of memorial that exists there. Next slide. So there's something, I'm going to finish with another clip. Oh, yeah, sorry. No, I won't. I'm just going to stay here. So I apologize because some of the slides weren't there that helped me do the transitions. For me, what's remarkable about thinking about the afterlives of empire and the explosive inauguration of what's supposed to be a trauma and a primal scene that I want to stress to you is that to Cubans themselves, it fades into the background. That power fades into the background, that the monuments are seen as degraded and decayed. To Americans, and living in the United States, where New American Studies in the 80s and 90s rethought of this, right? The main and the attendant imperial project around it became sort of primordial and obscured, right, a series of other things, right, of what was actually happening in Cuba. In much the way that Cuba obscures much of what happens around 1898, right, trans-Pacifically, transoceanically. So I want us to think about that, right? As Cuba, a little bit of the undead zombie, right, of 1898. It's too big, it doesn't ever go away. And for me, it's a deep relief, right, to have that protagonism be reduced, revoked, right, in a sense. By 2011, a film comes out called Juan de los Muertos, which is a remaking, a sort of Cuban remaking of Shaun of the Dead, a zombie movie, right? And the film presents you with a kind of virus that infects Cuba. It's a comic film. It's kind of a little bit homophobic, pretty homophobic, really, but presents you with a kind of post-apocalyptic Havana, right, in which most of the population is infected and zombified, and this kind of anti-hero faces, with his friend, a final scene to try and get off the island. And they come, and their apotheosis takes place in front of the USS Maine monument. So I'm going to play that for you. Adelante. So there you saw, right? They're at the base of the monument, right? And in fact, the monument by 2010 was in very, very bad shape. I think they made it look terrible for this, right? But it was restored in 2011, right? Eusebio Leal was part of that project, the restoring of the city of Havana. And the eagle itself, the head of the eagle by then was with the Americans, but the body was with Eusebio Leal, right? And Eusebio Leal very elegantly said, well, we will know that things are better when the body is reunited, right? So that other body, right, that other imaginary, that dismembered body is kind of fascinating to me. But the film ends with them staging a kind of final battle against their zombified compatriots, so much so that they create a kind of ramp of bodies, and then they drive off the island in a kind of car boat, right, that takes them away. The absolute kind of comedy, degradation, morbidity, right, the recoding not only of revolutionary rhetoric, because they start to call out to the zombies saying "Iconoclasta," they're using all the names that the revolution had used to kind of vilify opposition, right, in those years. And they staged this kind of comic, horrible, grotesque, and then finally animated scene. And I wanted to sort of to leave us there and to think about what is undead about those imaginaries of 1898. And what of those images and symbols are part of our own kind of primal themes as scholars from across that imperial kind of graveyard, right? And to also think that decay is good, right? Degradation of monuments is good, and given what we've been experiencing around monuments in this country, it's rather fascinating. And so Juan de los Muertos kind of makes me want to linger with you on the minor, on reducing, right, the primal scene, on destroying the monuments, but also thinking about explosions and terror, and how we still live with the logic of that time as being an American empire today. Right? Almost every single element that launched the U.S. into that war absolutely became this viable thing circulating today. So I feel a lot of you. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you to Matthew for inviting me to join this symposium and these discussions, and to Centro and Sulu for hosting us. So I'm going to share a brief excerpt of a chapter of a book, of my book that's forthcoming. The book, to give you a little background, is interested in situating Puerto Rico as a sort of a product of U.S. law and race. And to do that, it sort of looks at the way that Puerto Rico is developed through law, and goes sort of back to the way that Native American law and the law of African Americans and African American exclusion makes way for the law that is then sort of used to create Puerto Rico as what it is today, an unincorporated territory, and all that has meant for Puerto Rico. And so the first two chapters of my book do that history. I call it a legal genealogy, right? I look at the ways that this sort of long trajectory of US legal history makes Puerto Rico. And then in my third chapter, I then sort of consider what do these Supreme Court decisions known as the insular cases, what does it allow for? So that's what I'm going to share with you, is a little excerpt of the ways that in the early 20th century, Puerto Rico is remade, and the role that law played in that. I'm going to read a little bit. So, days after the 1-year anniversary of the arrival of the U.S. military in the archipelago on August 8, 1899, Puerto Rico withstood a crippling storm. Hurricane San Ciriaco swept through the Caribbean, flooding coastal areas, devastating the archipelago's central mountain region, and with it, Puerto Rico's coffee plantations. Dr. Bailey K. Ashford, in charge of the military field hospital in Ponce, described the stream of, quote, wax-like specters, men, women, and children, who spilled from the mountains that the storm had swept bare and brown. Ashford was stunned by the condition of the poor, bedraggled creatures that streamed into his hospital and with whose care he was charged. So stunned, in fact, that he wrote extensively about his experience in his autobiography, A Soldier in Science. There, Ashford recounts how the sight of so many suffering and pathetic peasants led him to hypothesize that there must be a parasitic or pathogenic reason beyond the purported rampant malnutrition, that such a wide swath of the territory's inhabitants were anemic and sick. Here, in this recounting of the aftermath of San Ciriaco, we are privy to the birth of tropical medicine in Puerto Rico, and concomitantly to the beginning of medical experimentation. Ashford's hypothesis and experiments eventually led him to discover the widespread problem of hookworm infection in Puerto Rico. Ashford's experiments and treatments, which were perfected in Puerto Rico with funds from the Rockefeller Foundation, would then be exported all over the world, from Brazil to India and other parts of the Caribbean and to the US mainland. These early experiments in tropical medicine are characteristic of Puerto Rico's experience in the early decades of the US rule. Puerto Rico quickly became a testing ground for experiments in health and sanitation, social hygiene, education, agriculture, economic development, and beyond. The creation of Puerto Rico as an experimental station was made possible by the vast power that the Supreme Court granted to Congress over Puerto Rico. In 1901, in the infamous case of Downs v. Bidwell, the court first established Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory under Congress's plenary or complete power. The first few decades of the 20th century saw U.S. government agents' attempts to reorganize and reformulate life in Puerto Rico in service of U.S. imperial designs, and Downs v. Bidwell was the gateway to those policies. The impulse to experiment with the lives of Puerto Ricans, to remake them into proper colonial subjects who fit U.S. ideas of respectability and who could be put to productive work in service of U.S. capital, is the colonial impulse for excellence. In this brief excerpt, I will focus on medical experimentation and on the underlying racialized assumptions that fueled such experiments. While the larger chapter focuses on health, labor, and policing as three crucial parts of the US colonial project in Puerto Rico, the changes implemented by the US government touched nearly every facet of Puerto Rican life. The perceived problems of overpopulation and of a sick and diseased population preoccupied US government agents in Puerto Rico. The concerns for the sickly and pathetic condition of the territory's inhabitants were expressed early on by the military actors and continue to be a source of consternation for US agents throughout the 20th century. These problems were addressed through a slew of policies that legalized divorce and birth control, encouraged migration to address overpopulation, and promoted medical experimentation in the case of health and sanitation. So and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to a section called Healing the Diseased Body, Bailey K. Ashford and the Birth of Tropical Medicine. And I'm sorry, I'm reading from my reader and there's a shadow, so I can't really see very well. So I'm trying to read while also looking at you all. From the early days of the arrival of the US military in Puerto Rico, the question of disease loomed large in the minds of US agents. The US Army initially encountered problems with mosquito-borne disease like malaria and yellow fever, such as it did in Cuba and Panama. Early accounts of the territory's inhabitants described Puerto Ricans as emaciated, sickly, and malnourished. The population was further described as indolent and lazy, a trait which was attributed to the tropical condition and heat of the archipelago. Though some argued that this indolence would never allow Puerto Ricans to become proper, enterprising US subjects, others saw these traits as in need of a remedy. Puerto Ricans only needed help from their US betters to leave behind a life of tropical lethargy and idleness. The opportunity to address the problem of disease arrived early on when Puerto Rico was struck by the worst hurricane in its history. The 1899 San Ciriaco storm left nearly 4,000 inhabitants dead and 250,000 homeless. Puerto Rico's mountainous regions were devastated, and its coffee plantations, the chief export crop at the time, were left in shambles. Shortly after the hurricane struck, survivors began pouring into cities. Temporary encampments and infirmaries were set up in the 12 major districts, and Ponce, along the southern Caribbean coast, was particularly badly hit. There, as the young doctor in charge of the Army Field Hospital, Ashford unwittingly stumbled upon the cause of Puerto Rico's perceived indolence and lethargy. As the displaced residents began arriving at the makeshift hospital, Ashford noticed their pale and waxy complexions and flabby skin. Recognizing the signs of anemia in the sickly and thin Puerto Ricans, he ordered that they be fed meat in order to supplement their iron intake. The soldiers in charge of feeding and caring for the patients began to report that rather than improving their health, that meat was making them sick and giving them diarrhea. The patients requested they be fed rice and beans and salted cod, their staple diet, which they knew would not make them sick. Ashford acquiesced and ordered that the patients be granted their usual diets in the hopes that their conditions would improve. However, much to his dismay, the patients continued to look frail and sick, and many died under his care. And so now I'm going to quote from Ashford's diary. As soon as the sacred rice, beans, and codfish arrived, everybody in the camp began to purr, Ashford wrote in 1934. But not the faintest tinge of blood came into their faces. Moreover, they kept dying. It must be said that they died happily and with their stomachs full. I catechized my wife, but she only replied, "That is the anemia of the country. They all die of it eventually. They say it's due to lack of food. But I fed them by order, and the ungrateful things keep dying." Ashford's frustration with the continued sickliness of his patients led him to sample and study their blood and eventually their stool. Through these studies, he discovered the great lethargy and sickness afflicting so many of the territory's residents was in fact due not to malnourishment, but instead to a parasite, hookworm, which entered the body through the feet. As many rural peasants lacked proper or often any footwear, the parasitic infection was widespread. Ashford began to experiment with procedures and remedies to rid his patients of the parasite, eventually stumbling upon a combination of purges that seemed to work. In April 1900, he published his findings in the New York Medical Journal, but it would be many more years before his findings were taken seriously. Many doctors and patients held firm to the idea that the sickness of so many of Puerto Rico's residents was caused by malnourishment rather than widespread parasitic infestation. Ashford's early experiments led to several campaigns to eradicate hookworm and anemia in Puerto Rico. Eventually, Ashford's research and his efforts in the archipelago led to the New York-based Rockefeller Foundation to offer its financial support to the campaign. A 1920 report in the Columbia, South Carolina newspaper, the state details the efforts of the Rockefeller Foundation and the great need in Puerto Rico. Despite the fact that Ashford had been working to address the problem of hookworm and anemia since 1900, the article cited Dr. Victor Helser of the Rockefeller Foundation as stating that there was more hookworm in Puerto Rico in 1920 than any other place in the world. And so now I'm quoting Dr. Helser of the Rockefeller Foundation. Hookworm is probably the most serious economic issue that Puerto Rico faces today. I have asked cane planters why they did not pay more wages, and they said because the laborers could not earn it, and probably they are right. Anemia, the article goes on to explain, quote, which during the Spanish rule was believed to be due mostly by malnutrition, now is attributed to a great extent to infection. It is believed that the disease was brought in with the early slaves and thus spread uncontrolled throughout the length and breadth of the island. In an attempt to address the problems of anemia and hookworm in Puerto Rico, the government and the foundation would invest $357,000 to, quote, bring relief to the unfortunate sufferers. A study, and this is still quoting the article, a study undertaken by the foundation has shown that nearly 90% of the population in rural areas harbor hookworm infection. Even light infection is said to cause mental retardation. Defective mentality thus produced renders the children incapable of assimilating instruction. And that's the end of the quote. The ability to assimilate instruction, of course, was paramount to the US government's colonial project in Puerto Rico. Tutelage in the American way of life was what the Supreme Court stated was most needed in Puerto Rico. Americanization and teaching Puerto Ricans how to be proper US subjects were essential steps in creating the tropical outposts the US sought. Thus, it was essential to clear the populace of the scourge of hookworm and its potential for diminished mental acuity and lethargy. American ideals valued enterprising, hardworking people who lifted themselves up by their bootstraps. Puerto Rican laziness and indolence was counter to that US-American narrative. Thus, it was necessary to discover the cause and cure the territory's inhabitants of their idleness. This, of course, would in turn create better workers who would be able to cut greater amounts of cane and buoy Puerto Rico's economy. The fact that the greatest benefactors of such economic growth were US corporations and US investors was, of course, essential to the drive to eradicate disease. While no doubt medical experiments in public health, such as Ashford's, were driven by a paternalistic desire to cure the poor Puerto Ricans of their disease and their lethargy, an equally important motivation was in creating a literal, healthy body of workers. These peasants were necessary lives, and as such, the state had an interest in ensuring they lived and were healthy enough to work. Thus, the policies which funneled money into hookworm eradication and the creation of Ashford's Institute for Tropical Medicine were tied to the state's need to shape who lived and how. At the time, too many of the necessary workers were dying with deep repercussions for the government's great moneymaker, the sugar industry. Likewise, the state article also offers us a glimpse into the racialized ideas about the source of disease in Puerto Rico that were common in that day. The article points to no source for its belief that hookworm infestation arose with the importation of enslaved Africans to the territory, and yet that claim is asserted as a fact. That the Spanish were incapable of managing their colonies and thus caring for their subjects was also a fact. The disease and infirmity were legacies brought by the enslaved to Puerto Rico was apparently also a fact. In these facts, we see the many beliefs undergirding the campaigns to eradicate disease in the territory. And as important as it was to have a healthy, productive workers, it was equally important to cleanse the US's new charge and to sanitize them. The origins of Puerto Rican's disease were enslaved Africans, and that sickness had been perpetrated by Spanish cruelty and indifference. It was now up to the US, Puerto Rico's white savior, to rid the inhabitants of their disease, to Americanize them and make them healthy and productive US subjects. The article's final sentence clearly illustrates the preoccupation with defect that US government agents in the territory had. Puerto Ricans had to be rid of disease, lest that disease produce a class of mentally defective subjects that could not assimilate the lessons of Americanization. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I mean, I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of thoughts. I know we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to make space for our audience to be able to ask some questions. But while everybody sort of gathers their thoughts and thinks a little bit, I do. So I think like when Matthew and I have talked about this event so much, I think like one of the things I was most excited about is as somebody who is mostly focused on Puerto Rican studies, it's just this amazing opportunity to learn about folks doing work on the Philippines, on Cuba, on Guam, American Samoa, Hawaii in this panel, right? And I think it would just be such a wasted opportunity to not let you also try and engage in that conversation with each other. I think there's so many like commonalities in these presentations. Like I'm already just making a lot of connections. I think it's really fascinating how all of you in different ways are sort of touching on narratives and like myth making, right? Like how is this like the nation state constructed, or like the colonial subject being constructed through like different narratives, whether it's like monuments or songs, or different portraits, right? So we've seen so many forms of these. So I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking, and especially in conversation with each other. Like the question of like militarization has come up in Keith's presentation and Yana's presentation, in Monica's. Monuments are coming up in Adrian's and Anna's, right? Just all of these sort of the importance of the symbolic and how all these these nationalities have sort of been, or, these ideas of the nation have been constructed. And also I have a note here. Sorry. Let me. I'm not going to talk too much more because I do want all of you to. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Actually, I won't. Take these notes, right, or sort of go further. But I really would love to see just like, have you learned anything from, or like, has anything surprised you? Are you now thinking about your own work or in different ways just because of like listening to these sort of comparative perspectives on life under empire in the 20th century? And I can pass these. There's multiple microphones. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
Right. One thing that comes to mind, and I'm so grateful to you guys and to have heard you. It's just brilliant. Is that thinking about monuments, right, and memory, because we're also thinking about memory, right? This mid 20th century, is that monuments are sort of the social hygiene of violence, right? Of colonial violence, right? Of militarization. It's the cleaning, right? The malecon, the clean street. It's the planning, right, of urban hygiene in Havana and San Juan and in the Philippines. So I that hygienic project to me, that's part of what I like about Juan de los Muertos, right? That there's a refusal, right, of that hygienic project in that's incipient, right, in all those imperial projects. Que limpia los muertos, that that hides the limbs and the dead. But I thought, like, I was really also vibing with you on the the martyrology of both like Rizal and Martí.
So the project Balik Bayan, like it took on so many different permutations, and my editor has been patient with me for years, as they often are. Like it started out like as a really, I wanted to do something with these portraits at the Filipino American National Historical Society, and this is an archive that has been painstakingly and lovingly sedimented over so many decades, right? Just as a sort of labor of love, but also labor of memorialization of the pre-World War II generation, and implicitly, if not explicitly, I think, because there's a way that for anyone who does public history work, like I'm a trustee of funds, right, that I often try to give way for folks to dictate the way that the textures of historical memory work, even in archival organization, because I'm just a straight up anarchist, and I know not everybody really vibes with that. But I think in a lot of ways, as much as we critique the 125th anniversary, or the obsession with particular dates, I read today as an act of collective mourning, especially as colonial and post-colonial subjects, right? Like, how do we not only tell these histories, but also let these histories sort of fall to the wayside? Like, so many of us skirt around 1898. Like, we're not thinking about the traditional historiography. We're not thinking about the periodization. We're letting the mnemonic of that rupture of 1898 do the work for us. And so to speak specifically about monuments, what I really vibe with the way that Anna, you were talking about, let the monuments fall to rubble. And that is the story of the Rizal Monument in Luneta Park in Manila, which is that I was in the Newberry archive just like reading these documents and thinking about just how many years it took from initial conception, which was 1901, and then fundraising, and then getting the artistic competition out, and then the debates over who gets to be an artist is a debate about race and colonial subject making as well. And then it becomes inaugurated when the Democratic Party gets elected and Woodrow Wilson gets elected to the United to the presidency and Congress, and they start really walking back on the colonial project, and it turns towards Filipinization, which is the peopling of native bureaucrats, right? To continue on our own colonial project, our own self-colonization in this emerging nation state. And it's at that point that it comes about, and then it enters its own life, right? It falls up, it keeps falling apart, like the I guess the pylon kind of part of the monument, they've had to replace it over and over again. And during the Marcos regime, that's when they would get, concrete, because the Marcoses had this obsession with concrete and urban development. And one of my uncles was the concrete provider for some of those projects. And so I think a lot about these material histories and what happens if we just literally let these things crumble, right? In the ways that we let the particular demarcations of historical time that we've inherited within this particular colonial, imperial, national project let themselves fold in on themselves, right? What does that do to how we think of as historically minded scholars and critics?
I'm just going to jump in. I think that's fascinating, especially because I think there is just work to be done in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, basically at the same time period, also being obsessed with concrete. So now, this is like another thing that's just like, here's another like point of connection, right? That I wouldn't have thought about, but it is this, it's like basically around, you can sort of map the same time periods. But yeah, that's super, super interesting. Yeah. Keith, Monica, Ileana, do you want to?
I just had two thoughts as Adrian was speaking. One of them is, yes, monuments are deteriorating, but then we create new monuments. And I was thinking precisely about the Cuban revolutionary experiment, and yes, we are deteriorating certain, but then which ones are the ones that are emerging? And I think that actually speaks a little bit to this notion of the afterlives, in the sense that, these icons keep coming up at different times, maybe with some different meanings, related meanings, all and new meanings, all of them. But we see that they are all happening, at different moments, not necessarily circular, not necessarily linear. But that speaks to why sometimes exercises like this one are so critical and so useful, because it helps us do that labor. And then the second thing that I wanted to say was, you asked us earlier, what have we learned from each other? And of course, I have learned so much. But I think that the one thing I'm learning here right now is what needs to be done next. And I think that we are, as much as we recognize each other's places, we still haven't done the work beyond comparison. And by this, I mean, how is it that thinking about the Philippines all the time in Puerto Rico, all the time, everybody's talking about the Philippines, actually shapes Puerto Rican policy? Because it's like whatever happens in Puerto Rico is going to happen in the Filipinas. So be careful with what you're doing on Puerto Rico. And so how do we start doing that sort of mirror work? That needs to happen. The same happens with Cuba. There's nothing that gets done in Puerto Rico that is not somehow related with Cuba. That's our preferred mirror relationship, isn't it? So, and so I think we need to do that a little bit more. I'm thinking precisely, one, dissertations that people may want to follow up. We don't have the Virgin Islands here, but it is not a coincidence that the Virgin Islands are, bought in 1917 at, World War I, but it's at the same time that Puerto Rico is having the Jones Act. We haven't done that labor yet either. So again, write it down for a future dissertation.
So I was just gonna quickly say, we have a Jones Act too, but like it produced completely different like historical things, right? And I'm just like, right, like it's not comparison, but it's like thinking about all these obfuscated connected tissues. Yeah.
I think that, well, thank you for the invitation. Like on the level of nerd, I'm nerding out, and I'm in deep appreciation and in all seriousness, the critical work around Vieques and Puerto Rico militarization, demilitarization has been instructive, informative for me and many others. Of course, a lot of social movements coming out of Caribbean and Spanish, Portuguese speaking Americas. I think the things around periodization, 1898, they speak to kind of what's the role of people that self-identify as public intellectuals. What are the roles in our fields? These are the kinds of debates that happen in different fields: history, philosophy, area studies. I think for me, what moving into the space around Samoan original gangsters, I didn't really flesh it out in the talk, but the broader historiographical, political, intellectual stake for me is to bridge the division between independent Samoa and American Samoa. Because I didn't talk about how 1898 severed politically the Samoas. There's a German colonization that took suit, followed by New Zealand British colonization in now independent Samoa. Then you have U.S. Samoa. Well, there's one Samoa to me, but there's this incredible. We're talking about the gaps, so-called gaps, in imperial amnesia in the U.S. and English, Spanish-speaking historiography, but there's also those kinds of imperial foreclosures in the British imperial historiography that covers Samoa, in the German-British Samoa. And so, like for me, being in these spaces is to kind of think through, where we might be in a certain place in time, And so, like, I'm in California. There's a lot of Samoans. I'm working in Samoan communities in Aotearoa, but it's as if the same communities are talking past each other. You know what I mean? In the historiography, in politics, right? And there's a migration route that takes place post-war from former New Zealand Samoa to Aotearoa, New Zealand, gets wrapped up in Maori, indigenous, Pakeha white politics, and then you have this migration point going to Hawaii into really entering a more explicitly racialized anti-Black U.S. Political economy. And so these are the things that I feel, I find instructive around comparison and place. And so I'm just grateful to be here and help think through some of these things. But yeah, I'll stop there. I can go on.
I'm thinking. I love the question of myth making. That's something that I think a lot about, and I've written a little bit about in the context of the narratives about Puerto Rico that you find in particular in U.S. government archives, and how then we, as colonial subjects, adopt those narratives. So this question of hookworm, I am fascinated by, in part because I grew up with my mom being like, "You cannot go barefoot. You must wear shoes." Yeah, right? Okay, hello. Colonial connections. Right? And so in my research, I read this story and I was like, this is where this comes from, right? This is from like a deep concern about parasites, right? That we still, right, in the 21st century are considering, right? So these are the kinds of like quirky historical moments that then we sort of adopt and retell. And if I ask my mom, why, she would not, but I now know, right? Because I've made this historical connection. And so I'm fascinated by those narratives and the ways those travel, right? And I know, and we know, right, because we've done this work, that the project of colonialism in Puerto Rico was attempting to mirror the project in the Philippines, right? It didn't work out that way for obvious reasons, right? But the types of sort of the impulse to kind of create these colonial projects that would mirror each other, or to take this type of colonial technology to Puerto Rico and then to take it to the Philippines, I am fascinated by the kind of hubris of that project, right? And then by the ways that then we as colonial subjects and our ancestors then refute that, or like
mess that project up, throw wrenches in it, adopt it, right? I mean, the eradication of hookworm was a good thing, right? It was a very good thing. But the impulse comes from this doctor who's like, what's wrong with these people? Why do they keep dying, right? Like I'm doing all the right things. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but all to say that I find this exchange incredibly fruitful for considering, right, the kind of technologies of empire, the ways that then they sort of dissipate throughout empire, and then we are sitting here sort of thinking collectively about them. I think it's beautiful. So thank you.
I want to open it up to the audience. Because we're on Zoom, please speak your questions into the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. Very fascinating. I love thinking through these connections. I'm also wondering about the other shadow of US empire, which are the global military bases and those kinds of occupations, and how the people living in these military base adjacent places are also colonial subjects. It's sort of a provocation question. If you want to speak on it or not, I allow you to.
I'll give the one sentence version, and this goes for statist claims, but also nationalist decolonial around military. In Oceania, at least, and even Asia, and this is a lot of folks, organizers, historians, it's not the question of decolonization per se that's more important. It's demilitarization. That we can have state and all these state and restate formations constantly, and what tethers all of them is military violence and empire making. That's the violence, and the U.S. is more recent manifestation of modern warfare, which is to kill civilian and non-civilian alike. That's very different from other warfares. And that's what tethers all these empires, is the militarized aspect. And so like all the nationalist movements that we're seeing in post-colonial movements, if they're still tethered to some kind of military state, then we just reproduce those things.
I have a mirror scene for you, which is Guantanamo and post 9/11, right? I was following very closely what the Cuban state was saying in its official discourse. And in an uncanny way, right, Fidel was writing mirror discourse about terrorism, right, and the threat of terrorism. And then you had what happened in Guantanamo happen in Guantanamo, right? Like black sites, like torture, all of it. And so the other side to the long colonial project is, even when you have an anti-imperial power that wants to measure itself against that major discourse, that mirroring continued. Like in the Cuban case, it's the most toxic, crazy, devastating thing in the world, right? But I always wondered, what was the deal? What deal took place after 9/11? Some deal took place in order to allow the Cubans somehow had a conversation about what Guantanamo would become, right? Because there was a realpolitik that took place there. So you have very different instances, right? In each case, right? Each site is different, right? I don't know, like Puerto Rico is a whole other thing. So
Okay. I think this is also sort of my indebtedness to like your book, Militarized Currents, and my mentors like Lisa Yonema, Tak Fujitani, who think about like militarization and militarism as something other than like formal occupation, but as something that completely ontologically as well as materially reorients both local life and also these global connective tissues. So to answer your question, I've been writing, and we are currently trying to sell my memoir, which is about my father's martial arts gym that he taught for 20 years back in Toronto. But it's also like it's a sort of stand-in for a colonial history of Filipino martial arts, understanding martial art culture, including like karate, which is Okinawan and not Japanese, right? Or like Taekyon, which then becomes encoded as Taekwondo with the rise of the South Korean neo-colonial economy, or like Muay Thai, right, with Thailand as a sort of like neo-colonial state, right, junior partner, quote unquote, States during the Cold War, right? What is it about martial cultures and literal militarization that come to shape each other? And that's the story of my family. And my dad's mentor, who he's like 95 years old, and he was one of the like OG founders of like Filipino martial arts. And he lives in San Diego, and he lives in San Diego because of the military base. Because like he was, someone spoke about Mindanao earlier, right? Like, and he's from Mindanao, and he had to convert to Catholicism for safety, and never liked Catholicism. And then he, got employed by the Philippine military and then the U.S. military, and taught them like our indigenous martial arts, right? Martial practices and dances and cultures. And the military folks like turned it into their own like sport, right? But it was through martial labor that would shape literally martial law in the Philippines, U.S. empire abroad, and the Israeli Defense Forces, who are all trained by Filipinos, right? That afforded both my father's mentor and my father the opportunities to move to North America, right? As experts of martial arts, like actors and soldiers and other experts were training with my father, who's like a really renowned Filipino martial artist. And yet, why is it that Filipino martial arts is known as Filipino martial arts? It's like this conglomerate of a bunch of different practices. And number two, why is it not visible in the way that Taekwondo is, right? Because Filipino martial arts is the literal labor force for global militarism and military propaganda, which is Hollywood action movies. Like everybody is trained by students of the same Filipino martial arts expert, Danny Inosanto, who trained with Bruce Lee. And so just like I think like the way that I'm thinking about militarism is I sort of had to think about how would I write about like my family's deep relationship with the military one day. It's so personal in that like everybody in my family has black belts, right? Because of this militarized history. And it's the thing that kept my family ticking. And every Saturday we'd set up the mats, we'd go to a community center, we'd work with like, local folks from my hometown. And yet this opportunity to have this like embodied ethnic studies classroom, which is how I think about it, was literally enabled by these labor transits of US military violence. So that's what I'll offer.
I few thoughts. That doesn't mean that they're together, though. One is to think, to remember that when we're thinking about militarization, it's not only about the army and the Air Force, etc., but that, in the case of Puerto Rico, installations that used to be military forts are right now museums, or museums of the military. Or we have, for example, another fort that is actually the site for Border Patrol. So I think that I want us to remember that there are all these many ways in which militarization gets reproduced that are sometimes invisible to us. Policing, so the ways in which, for example, we have a war on drugs, and in Puerto Rico, this has become even more louder in the last few years. It's when you have a place that is devastated, believe me, that's time for the illicit economy of drugs to boom. So and that's not only, then we have that other web of supposedly, as good Latin American historians, and I'm looking here at David, all these loans that were given and assistance that were given to Salvador and Nicaragua, they're all really subcontracting and for training and for weapons. So this is huge. This is very huge. And then I wanted to just mention, Puerto Rico is the only border patrol unit outside of the United States, outside of continental US, is in Puerto Rico. And who is it that they are actually, policing, disciplining? Is black bodies in the water, Cubans, Haitians, and Dominicans. Another dissertation, because that's not written yet.
just give a big round of applause to our panelists. This was fantastic.